Welcome everyone to a episode of Afikra Conversations. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Professor George Saliba, who is a professor of Arabic and Islamic Science and is the founding director of the Farouk Jabre Center for Arabic and Islamic Science and Philosophy and the holder of the Khwarizmi Chair in Arabic and Islamic Science. He occupied the chair of Distinguished Senior Scholar at the Cluj Center at the Library of Congress Carnegie Scholar, and is the author of Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance, which came out in 2007, in addition to many, many other books. Professor Saliba, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm very happy to be with you and again to talk about things that are very dear to my heart. Thank you so much for giving me the chance. Thank you.
No, it's a thrill and a privilege for us. So I want to get started with a really basic question, and I want to go back to first principles, which is the term, the golden age of Islam, is a term that is thrown around a lot by people who have strong opinions about when that golden age was, and people who have no idea when it was. In your estimation, when was the golden age of Islam, and why do some people disagree about this?
That's an excellent question, but again, it begins to open a Pandora's box. These kinds of age classifications, or I think what my friends in Paris call periodization categories, they are inventions supposed to facilitate our work or to direct our work. Usually, once you get to a time in your research to begin to look from distance and to classify what kind of period you're dealing with, usually this is inaccurate because it comes from a distance to start with. Two, to tell you the truth, the way I have even come into these things to deal with these terms, I encountered them first in what I call Orientalist literature, meaning on people who wrote about Islamic civilization, whether in English, French, German, or what have you, and they were the ones who decided when was the best period in Islam, when was the worst period, and hence they came up with these ideas. And unfortunately, the people who actually read the original sources, meaning the people of Islam themselves who can read the Arabic, read the Persian, read all of those sources, they simply took them out from the Orientalists and adopted this terminology. So as a result, we began to take the whole civilization production and squeeze it so that it fits into the golden age. That was my motivation, is to actually test this golden age, and I wanted to know what made it so golden. And I wanted to know, when did it begin, as a matter of fact? And then I found that neither the beginning of the so-called golden age nor the end of that so-called golden age, none of them actually fit any of the sources that I read every day before I go to sleep. Meaning I read, for example, texts on science and philosophy and sort of this, and all of them are written in Arabic, and I don't see any of them saying, here I want to begin a new age. The normal growth of the intellectual history does not announce at any time that there is a golden age. Now, when you go into the Orientalist literature themselves to figure out why did they come up with this terminology, you find there is an agenda behind it. Meaning, Orientalism studied the other civilizations not for the purpose of learning from them, but for the purpose of trying to see how to subjugate those other civilizations. The French are the prime example. For example, they called their period of colonization mission civilisatrice, meaning we don't go and step down on people, we civilize people. That kind of thinking already says that what the natives have produced is irrelevant, and hence we have to bring to them this higher ideology, this higher science, this higher intellectual history and all of that. And hence it already denigrates the local population, denigrates their production, makes them almost insignificant, but at the same time, they are not totally negligible. Because, I'll give you an example. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought with him about 200 to 300 scientists, scholars of every field and every place. In other words, he knew, the French knew at the time, that there is a lot to learn about Egypt and about the Islamic world, and the invasion of Napoleon is an opportunity. The establishment of the so-called Institut d'Egypte, which still survives, is due to that period, meaning it's exactly Napoleon who set it up and wanted to investigate everything. They wanted the biology, they wanted the geology, they wanted the history, they wanted every single thing in the civilization they wanted to study. That, of course, is a colonial project. They wanted to study it so that we can see how to control those populations that now are under our aegis. Luckily, I don't know, luckily for the Brits, they found out very quickly that Napoleon is already there in Egypt, and that is a dangerous thing. He is sitting right astride from their passage to India. So they sent Lord Nelson to pick him up and to actually reverse this process, but simply to take over themselves. And hence, in the fight between the two colonial powers, between the French and the English on one side and the other, both of them decided that they really want to treat this local population in the best way, governable way, meaning they want to govern them. Give you another example. Yeah. When the British finally ended up in India in the 18th century, and they started the first census of the population, and literally began to count the Indian population that fell under their control. They did not count them by 1 Indian, 2 Indians, 3 Indians. They counted them by 1 Muslim, by 1 Hindu, by 1 Sikh, and so on. Meaning they counted them by their religious affiliations. And very quickly realized that this religious affiliation kind of arrangement is very smart, because it destroys the society from the very beginning. It doesn't allow the society to come together as citizens. It allows them only to come as allegiance to specific religion, and so on and so forth. Now, who learned from that? The French, who in 1789 has given up through their revolution, l'égalité, liberté, fraternité, tout ça. There was no, and in fact, the whole revolution was against the aristocracy and the church in the French. The French looked at what the British did in India, and then figured out it was a marvelous way of destroying the society. Hence, when they were given the mandate by the World of Nations at the time over Lebanon and Syria, they immediately followed the same procedure. They counted them by Maronites, Druze, Sunnis, Shiites, all of them, and we are still stuck in the very same place as it is today. We need 1 Maronite president, for example. Right now in Lebanon, we are stuck. So all of this is a background to tell you that most of the thinking of our history was not done by us. It was done by these powers who at the very beginning were already past their age of the so-called age of enlightenment, which produced immediately the age of colonialism. And that enlightenment, of course, assigned for Europe the role of enlightened, for other civilizations, the role of less civilized. Hence, already you have a disruption of the thinking process, and the Golden Age was born during this melee. And I suspect the Orientalists actually thought along those lines, because they were coming also at the end of their own period of religious wars Remember the 100 years religious wars in
What year
Europe?
are you talking about now?
Now, I'm talking about 19th century people who actually began to think of such categories as the Golden Age. They had history in Europe, which actually taught them that this classification of civilizations depends very much on the religious affiliations. For example, it is in the European history itself that tells us that after the 16th century, in the 17th century, is called the Age of Reason. They give this superior role to it. And then at the same time, they also give us the categories of thinking that reason never goes along with religious thinking. And hence, it is when reason overcomes religion, this is the time when civilization can begin to progress. Yeah. So they looked at the Islamic civilization and they found actually all schools of thought, of legal thought in Islamic structures were between the 9th century and the latest, I think, is about the 12th, 13th century. And since they were interested by the legal procedures that control the behavior of the population, they figured out the Golden Age is the age when we have these legal schools, from Abu Hanifa to Ibn Hanbal to Shafi'i, and later on in the Andalusian schools of the Zahiris. They figured out that this is it, because now we have the kind of code by which we control the population. Since there were no legal schools to spring up after the 13th century, they figured there is no interest in even studying the civilization. We know how to control them. We know the legal procedures. We know what motivates them. We know how religious law should be applied to all of them. Hence, that term was born in the bosom of this kind of terminology. So it's nothing to do with science. It's nothing to do with brain. Has nothing to do with the production of the people themselves.
So let me ask you a question. So from the context of scientific production and cultural production, where do you, instead of that invisible barrier at the 12th century, what level of scientific and intellectual and cultural production was there beyond the 12th century?
That's very good. Excellent question. Because again, in the previous classification that I told you, the Orientalists had actually modified it and began to think along lines, when is religion supreme? When is age of reason supreme? Hence the classification of reason versus religion as copying their own mind, the history of Europe. And they thought the history of Europe, after all, has to apply everywhere, because that's what civilization is. That's where we test the grounds and so on and so forth. That's where the myth was born that Galileo was the sacrificial lamb of the church, that because the Catholic Church has condemned Galileo, therefore we should say anytime religion wins, reason loses. But then also when they look for parallels, when is the age in the Islamic civilization, for example, that we can see a demonstrable evidence of religious superiority, is when we begin to see the production of very intelligent religious scholars from the type of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the type of Ibn Taymiyyah, and then later on, all the way into the 16th, 17th century, religious scholars who produce fantastic work. And those people actually understood the role of religion versus the role of reason. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah gives us a book. Ibn Taymiyyah is supposed to be a Hanbali, meaning close religious affiliate. And Ibn Taymiyyah gives us a book that's called Dar' al-Ta'arud Bayn al-Aql wal-Naql. Literally to say, there is no such a difficulty between what we get from the religious sciences, which are the Naql, and the sciences that were produced by our reason. And this book, by the way, is in 9 volumes. Each volume is about 800 to 900 pages. Ibn Taymiyyah was not chewing gum. He was actually producing first rate to say this category, this kind of division between religious sciences and intellectual sciences is fake. And let me show you, and he does show it, as I said, in 9 volumes plus or multiplied by about 900 pages each. So you can see what he has done.
Is there a pocketbook edition that...
You would wish. You would wish. Actually, the only statement of Ibn Taymiyyah that I always quote, and I love it very much, because he actually read the work of Ghazali, who came about 200 years earlier. Ghazali actually wrote a fantastic book. He called it Tahafut al-Falasifa, literally the incoherence of the philosophers. And the people that he is attacking at the time are the Islamic philosophers who copied and tried to apply Greek philosophy without understanding the underpinnings of that philosophy and without questioning the rationale of it. And he says they made mistakes, not because they are Greeks, not because they are not Muslim, but because they don't even know how to play with logic and how to play with the scientific precepts that they themselves have accepted. Now, in this Tahafut, when Ibn Taymiyyah read the Tahafut of Ghazali, he first read, by the way, I'm sorry, Ghazali produced a book before the Tahafut, which he calls it Maqasid al-Falasifa. Literally, he wanted to be fair. Before attacking them, he wanted to give their case. And their case, the Maqasid al-Falasifa, is an excellent demonstration, elaborate demonstration of how Greek philosophy ought to be understood, so that we can show its faults in the other book. So Ibn Taymiyyah tells him, you made a mistake. You shouldn't have started by praising and writing the Maqasid, because there will be times when people will not get the second book. They will only read the Maqasid, and they will be convinced that Greek philosophy is superior. That is the response. But this is the debate that was going on. Ibn Taymiyyah is about 100 to 200 years after Ghazali, and Ghazali died about 1111. So we know exactly when is the debate taking on. And this is the book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, which Ghazali produced, simply called The Incoherence of the Philosopher. The Orientalists read it as Tahafut al-Falsafa, literally as an attack on philosophy, when in fact, Ghazali is probably the best philosopher ever produced, because he understood exactly how science should be questioned from a philosophical precept and how we should understand the philosophical underpinnings. And hence he was writing philosophy of science. Yeah. But this is the capsule story of where we begin to think that those people who categorize the end of the Golden Age by the assault of Ghazali, and of course it happens to be doubled with the attack of the Mongols on Baghdad in 1259, which was also super exaggerated. Yeah. When I looked at the books and the manuscripts that are still with us, I looked at them that were written after Ghazali. Surprised, I found that the best production that was produced in the sciences was produced after Ghazali, not before. So how can we call this age of decline and the other age of golden age? So I specifically titled the book that I produced from NYU Press in 1994, I simply called it A History of Arabic Astronomy, the Golden Age of Islamic Science, which really classifies all the work that comes after Ghazali as the best production ever produced in at least the field of astronomy. And now you can see from those arrows, I hope everybody sees them, that you begin with the text of a Greek text of the Almagest written by Ptolemy, and then by the 13th century, this text is reproduced with an explanation by Tusi called Tahrir al-Majesty. So in other words, he takes the text and makes it palatable for students to be able to, and immediately that text began to produce itself other texts compiling on it. So we have one comment over another comment and so on, but all of them have an intention. Their intention is to actually cleanse the inherited, the Greek astronomical production of its failures as scientifically based science, and to produce a better one, to get at the very end with a guy called Shamsuddin al-Khafri, who died about 1550, that is 300-400 years after Ghazali, and he produces two books. He produces Muntaha al-Idrak and At-Takmila, and the third book that he produces called Hal Ma La Yanhal. Literally, all the difficulties that he had encountered in the Greek tradition, he managed to solve them, and he produced a small book at the very end. This is the kind of debate that was going on for hundreds of years.
Let me ask you a question, though. Let's talk about, for those listening to the podcast who can't see the screen, let me just describe what's on the screen right now, just for a second. So there's all these, there are four different scholars that are from 1274 onward, as you just mentioned. Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi died 1274. Yes. And then all the way down to Shamsuddin al-Khafri, who died in 1550.
Yes.
But the first question I have is, and we're going to go through some of these theorems, is Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, as you mentioned, published al-Tahrir al-Majisti, which is a commentary, as you just said, on Ptolemy's al-Majest, right?
Yes.
I'm probably mispronouncing that.
Yes.
And there are, 1,400 years difference between those texts.
Yes.
Is Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi literally reading the ancient Greek and translating it and commenting directly, or have there been other translations, other commentaries over those 1,400 years?
Excellent question. Thank you so much for helping me actually fill in the footnotes. Nasir ad-Din could not read Greek. I am absolutely certain of that. But he was so well educated in the Arabic tradition that had already started translating the Greek material for their own purpose, not because they were simply enamored by the Greeks, but they needed some of the questions that were solvable only if you apply the Greek material. They began to translate the best Greek texts that were translated, the Al-Majest, for example, and I keep this slide, or I'm sure, sorry, the audience may not be able to see it. They actually had the text of the Al-Majest was translated into Arabic at least 3 or 4 times before the end of the 10th century, meaning that this text was so recognized as a central text in difficulty, in technical composition, that it was taken as a basis for, and actually, by the way, Ptolemy himself simply called it al-Majest, al-Syntaxis Megistus, literally the great collection of mathematical works.
Yeah.
But then into the Arabic Magist, when you have the definite article added to it, that's what gave it the al-Majest. Now, this has been done already by about 300-400 years before Tusi. The famous translator by the name of Al-Hajjaj ibn Matar, who actually signed the only manuscript that still survives. It has a signature on the outside, and the manuscript is in Leiden. Up till today, the number I think is 395. That manuscript says, "Mimma amara binaqlihi al-Ma'mun," in the Christian year 829. So Tusi is writing in 1246 actually. So it's about 300 years later. He had inherited all those translations, and it was Hajjaj who was, while translating the Greek text, discovers that this Greek text has mistakes in it. So he corrects them silently and politely. He doesn't stop and say, La'natullahi alayh, this guy is a Greek and he's an idiot. But he corrects them and makes them palatable. Yeah. Now, when Tusi, if you go back to the previous slide, I think, when Tusi was trying to summarize the Almagest and to make it even better for a student approach so that the students can actually benefit from it, he tried to explain what was contained in the Almagest. And when he was discussing the movements of the planets in latitude, he found that Ptolemy has imagined things that could not actually happen. So what does he do? He writes here in the middle of the commentary. He says, أقول هذا كلام خارج عن الصناعة. Tusi is saying that the speech of Ptolemy 400-600 years earlier is really immaterial for astronomy because it is not subjected to the craft of astronomy, meaning it's not precise enough to be taken. And then he says, in this, I can help Ptolemy out of his own mistakes, and I propose a new theorem. The theorem is in this manuscript, which was composed in 1246, tells you that you can produce linear motion as a result of two circular motions, which is the principle that your car still produces for you now. Meaning when your piston goes up and down, that motion, which is linear motion, gets translated into circular motion on your wheels. So the theory of Tusi, who invented it, it was Tusi who invented it, is responsible for your car on the street. But it is the courage with which these people read the original Greek text, people like Tusi to say, أقول, meaning now he's not commenting on Ptolemy anymore. He is saying, my opinion is his speech is utter nonsense. This is cocktail party conversation. This is not serious astronomy, but then we can fix it. And he begins by fixing it in his book, which was written in 1247. And then by fixing it, he says, this is how, you see, I wish, or he wishes he had a video at the time. He could actually take those 4 shots and run them together to show you how circular motion can produce linear motion. And he actually was not satisfied by that. He proved it mathematically. Yeah. That actually, if you take these circles and run them like this, they will produce a linear motion, which by itself, the theorem was found very attractive. To whom? The picture on the right, I wish your audience could see the picture. The picture on the right comes from the work of Copernicus, who comes after Tusi by about 300 years. Copernicus finished writing his book in 1543. Tusi finished writing actually in 1259, and he died in 1274. So when you have a theorem, and in fact that theorem is picked up by somebody like Copernicus, you are entitled to ask, did he know? Did he know what he was using? And worse,
he doesn't reference him.
No, not only that, apparently he didn't even know that much, but he actually was slavishly copying what Tusi had done. When you compare the proof that was put in the text of Tusi, which still survives, and with the one that was produced in the work of Copernicus, you will find even the geometrical designations of the points in the diagram, where you have Aleph in Arabic will be rendered as A in Latin. Ba in Arabic is rendered as B in Latin. Jim in Arabic is rendered as G in Latin. Dal in Arabic is rendered as D in Latin. Come on. If I ask you to draw a triangle ABC, you put ABC wherever you want. But he was stuck with the drawing that he had, and obviously he must have had somebody who was explaining it to him and who misread the last point, which was at the center, at the center of the epicycle. He read it as Fa, when in fact in the Arabic text is Zain. You know, if you know the Arabic alphabet, you know Zain and Fa are very close if they are scribbled by hand, as these things were scribbled. Then you can catch him actually unprepared. So in fact, this is the proof that the F in the Latin text of Copernicus is a misreading of the Arabic Zayn in the Tusi text. And this is not only this, several other cases when Copernicus was picking up material from Arabic, he really did not know very well what he was reading, and as a result integrated them into his own Latin works. They became part of his own legacy, and that is the story of how the Renaissance came to be. It came to be on the basis of the wreckage that they have produced out of the Arabic sources that they picked up, people like Copernicus. This is not the only one, by the way.
Yeah,
I can name 6 or 7 distinguished Renaissance scientists who relied heavily on the Arabic material to understand the science of the 16th century, meaning of the Renaissance.
without crediting it.
No, well, you see, again, the idea of crediting, plagiarizing, all of those are modern things.
No, but it's not, I don't mean by crediting as a courtesy. I mean, crediting the same way Tusi was crediting Ptolemy, as in commenting directly.
At the same time.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine if Copernicus was also saying, well, you know, Tusi got this right clearly, but this he didn't understand. But that's not what he did.
That's not true. Yeah, because again, we really still do not know the points of contact between Copernicus and the Islamic civilization. We know it in other cases. We know it, for example, in the case of the famous surgeon and anatomist by the name of Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius actually says in his book on the fabrica of the human body, he tells us when he reaches the end of book 1 of the fabrica, and he had already named all of the bones in the human body, he says, now I will give you the names of those bones in Latin, in the vulgar Latin, in the educated Latin, and then he will say, I will give them also in Arabic, which I had access to them through the help of my friend Lazarus, the Jew from Frege, because Lazarus with me, that is what Vesalius said. Lazarus was reading Avicenna with me in Arabic through Hebrew translations, and hence he is the link between the Arabic Avicenna and the Latin of Vesalius. And in this case, we know exactly who was reading and who was helping. In the case of Copernicus, we don't have such a witness. And I wish that Copernicus would have stopped and done exactly what Vesalius, his contemporary. They're both in Padua. Both of them are actually dealing with superior scientific material, creating what we call the Renaissance. And both of them should have at least had the same mentality. Vesalius is much, much more honest. He actually wanted to know every idea that he got, where did he get it from, who passed it on to him, and that's why his friend Lazarus, the Jew from Frege, is credited in his own Fabrica of the Human Body.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears slightly and move on to another one of your books and areas of expertise.
This is creating problems for me now. The role of the astrologer or the mechanical devices, all of them.
Yeah, so I want to ask you a question about this.
Years ago, they passed unnoticed, but now people are noticing. But that's okay.
So there's a old paper that you wrote decades ago, the role of the astrologer in medieval Islamic society. And so I have a basic question for you.
Yes.
In 2023, astronomy is considered something scientific, and astrology is considered cocktail party chatter, as you mentioned. And I'm curious
that we celebrate at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, and the television people bring us those guys who read our future. That is the kind of astrology. Yes.
Was that true back then? Was astrology considered a science? And what is the difference when we think about medieval Islamic society?
That is an excellent question again. Astrology was always a part and sister to astronomy. In fact, the Greek word for astronomers or astrologos are the same word is used for both of them. Literally means testing the stars. And when they were translated into Arabic, they found that that part which describes how the stars move and how their behavior as astronomy proper, those were to be distinguished from the ones where the positions of the stars determine if you should get married on Friday or not, or if your baby is going to be a brilliant future politician. Those two, even people like Farabi, who died in 950, actually classified them and said there are two types of science that we relate to the stars. One we call علم النجوم التعليمي, meaning the mathematical description of how the stars move, and that is pure phenomena. That is best way to translate it is cosmography. Is actually to describe how the world around us is. Then he says, and there is another one which is called علم النجوم الإحكامي, literally how the stars judge our behavior and actually determine whether Wednesday is good for marriage or for producing a baby girl. That kind of the interpretation was always there, and from all the way back from the Greek times, because if we read the Greek sources properly, we will find even Aristotle, when he comes to discuss the function of the spheres that carry the planets around us, he himself tells us that all this world of change and new beginnings actually is caused by the movements of those spheres. Hence, it is not a big jump to say, as we notice in the spring, flowers sprout because of the change of season, and in the fall, they die and then they go, then it is probably the same thing happens, the same influence on the human bodies, and therefore we should actually interpret that and generalize it. So it was well kept and well stuck into Greek philosophy that was inherited by the Islamic civilization, and thanks to actually the early Muslim scientists and philosophers who encountered the Greek text, who actually said, wait a minute, this part of astronomy that actually describes the behavior of the planets is okay, because it's mathematical, we can predict. I can tell you and actually produce tables to be able to tell you where will the planet Mars be on March 11 in Baghdad and at noon, for example. But the second part that actually speaks about the influence of the stars on us, that is greatly doubtful, and hence it should be shunned away. And hence they actually gave birth to a new discipline. They call it ilm al-hay'a. Hay'a is cosmography, the original, simply to say that they do not want to deal with the astrology, but they want to deal with the part of astronomy that deals with the behavior of the planets as a phenomena around it. So that kind of classifying, that kind of critiquing the sources that they were picking, trying to cleanse the Greek tradition, produced for us what we now call proper astronomy. And but that does not mean, by the way, that Hayek and what's her name, Farah, will be out of business, because every new year you invite them to the TV and they give you predictions on what is going to happen tomorrow. And they probably get out of the interview from the TV a good amount of fresh dollars.
That's true.
There is a function for people. It is in the same way when people at cocktail parties, they ask you to take your coffee cup and tip it and read the signals on the traces of the coffee. Yeah. That kind of entertainment was always there. And throughout civilization, we always had a use for an astrologer. Those astrologers actually were entertainers. The equivalent of our Maggie and the equivalent of Hayek and the equivalent, and there are newcomers every year. We have a whole new crop that comes up on TV, and they all flourish about the beginning of the year, by the way, which is very interesting. By February, everybody forgets about them, and then they have to remember what they did before that.
Professor, let me ask you a question. When were you first interested in all of this stuff, and what got you interested? What was your entry point into the history of science?
Again, I want to thank you. You put the questions that are so elegantly stirring and so elegantly fascinating. I became interested in this material. I was a student of mathematics, by the way. So when I finished my degree here at AUB, I was a mathematics student, so I had a choice to either do mathematics or advance in other fields. But then when I began to read classical texts and then began to find the confusion with them, I began to wonder, what did the Arabic tradition do of these texts? And that's when I began to encounter the kind of behavior that actually came to us from the classical text first, meaning the astrologers of Assyria, of Babylonia in the year 2000 or so before the birth of Christ, they were commissioned to do exactly the same thing that we do every evening of every new year. They were commissioned to give to the king projections of what happens of the coming year. And we have those reports. They are actually on cuneiform tablets, and those tablets are preserved, and they're even published, so people could actually look at them. So the history of astrology is very ancient because there is an anxiety in human soul. We need to know what will happen tomorrow. We will never solve the problem, but we will never be satisfied by just any question, any answer. So we need to constantly re-ask the question. In fact, the funny part is one of those astrologers who wrote to the king of Nippur tells him, we watched for the eclipse of the moon tonight, meaning they could predict when the eclipse is going to take place, meaning those people had the control of proper astronomy, but then they tell the king, unfortunately, it was cloudy tonight. So, meaning we couldn't watch it. But that kind of behavior that we can document all the way back to 2000 BC or so is well ingrained in all human civilizations. It is rooted into the anxiety of man. He wants to know, or woman for that matter, who wants to know what will happen tomorrow. So that's where astrology satisfies all those questions, and actually gives us entertainment. And
before we move on to the quick Q&A, you were mentioning, that book, the one that we have on the screen, The History of Arabic Astronomy, sort of commenting directly on the colonialism, the impact of colonialism on the framing of when the Golden Age started and when it didn't. And you mentioned that book came out in 94, which is to say that there has been, 20 years, 30 years of people being able to respond and react and be influenced by that suggestion. Do you feel like there has been a shift in the academy in response to those types of ideas being posited?
Well, again, I have lived long enough and seen civilizations and read their histories enough to know that bright ideas, no matter how strongly supported they are, do not actually take place tomorrow morning. Meaning, things that you produce will have to filter down first into articles. Articles will also get simplified further into magazines, and then magazines will put them into newspapers. And then when the newspapers get all the way down to the shoe shiner, then ideas will begin to spread. So
I'm the shoe shiner in this analogy, by the way.
No denigration. They do a respectable job. In some cases, better than our politicians. At least they do something.
In almost every case.
Yeah. But it's in other words how knowledge passes from one layer to the other layer is complicated. But ultimately it does. Meaning, for example, concepts like the Golden Age and so on, they were dreamt for reasons. They were configured for specific interpretation of the behavior of civilization. And then finally, they began to be common parlance. Everybody talks about them as if we know them. And then when you look at them a little bit closer, you find out that we really don't know them. We are actually are myths that need to be abandoned. But people are, sometimes they are lovingly attached to their dreams, attached to their myths, of all sorts of emotional reasons that actually capture. People do not behave always in a rational fashion. For example, we know here at this university, at AUB, it says tobacco-free university. They don't say anything about tambak, about argili, as if to say that if you really are addicted, you can bring your own argili into the... And again, the idea that we all know that tobacco is dangerous. It actually harms you. But yet, there are all sorts of excuses that people keep postponing, or they keep saying that, oh, I only smoke 4 or 5 cigarettes a day. What does that mean? It means you kill yourself a little bit. You get only a little pregnant, but the damage is already done.
Yeah. Okay, let's do our quick Q&A and then we will wrap up. The first question, these are questions we ask all of our guests. The first question is, what are you reading or watching these days?
That's very good. These days I have an article to finish. And actually I'm reading a biography that's a very complicated biography of a patriarch, a Syriac patriarch of the Church of Antioch and the rest of the East. That patriarch happens, by all sorts of complicated reasons, to be invited in the year 1578, I mean just about the end of the 16th century, invited to participate in the committee that actually organized and determined what is the Gregorian calendar. How should we reset the ages for Easter and so on? And it was this patriarch who participated, invited by, of course, Gregory XIII, after whom the calendar is named. He was invited by Gregory, and who actually ran away from Diyarbakir. He comes from Mardin originally. He ran away to Europe with a whole bunch of books with him, books on astronomy, on medicine, and all of that. He brought them, and a good number of those books are still at the Laurentiana in Florence up till today. That patriarch, Ghannatus Na'mi is his name, he actually has encountered in his own life things that are extremely interesting. And I am trying to straighten out a little bit his biography to be able to figure out what was his qualifications to be invited by the Pope to sit on the most rigorous scientific committee to actually determine how the Gregorian calendar should be established. And up till now, it's not all over accepted. By the way, the Gregorian calendar was not accepted by the Patriarch of Russia. It's still not. Again, they shift, and it depends on political reasons, on all sorts of other reasons. So that man is fascinating. His history is fascinating. So I'm reading it right now and trying to write something on him. And
okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question.
Okay.
The next question is, who would you love to shadow for a day? If you could choose one person to spend an entire day with as their shadow.
Oh, that's a very good question. I never thought about it. And again, being an academician and filled with self-egoistic admiration, I'd like to have a mirror with me all the time. No, I'm joking. Okay. If I really had a chance, I would like to have been able to walk around with Copernicus and ask him, why didn't he do the same thing that his colleague Vesalius did? Vesalius told us almost verbatim every single new idea that he brought, where did he bring it from, and who was the medium through which he got it. That, I think, is an admirable. I would love to be able to meet Vesalius as well, to actually figure it out. How did he actually figure out the whole anatomy of the human body from fresh, with the help of reading the text of Ibn Sina? Avicenna is quoted hundreds of times in the text of Vesalius.
All right, next question. What do you think people most misunderstand about your work?
They think that I deal with astrology, and they all want to know if they should get married on Friday or not. Because I deal with what they consider, what people consider dead material already, and they have no idea why do I do what I do, and they misunderstand the function of studying history. The reason I do the history is to look for the future and not to actually be buried in the history. And it's a difficult thing to convince people that there are lessons to learn from history, and only if we read it properly, we will be able to project its functionality for our future. That kind of thing is difficult to explain, but luckily I think some of my students are brilliant and they do that.
Great. So we have a couple questions in the chat. I'll read them out. The first one is, where does Professor Saliba see the future of Islamic philosophy and /science, i.e., will it impact philosophy of science, logic, metaphysics, psychology, and ethics?
The future is to bring a generation who can actually, or at least if we fail, to bring up a generation who can read our own sources, meaning the tradition sources themselves. The manuscripts are still there in plenty. Every single library, and there is a Saliba law by it. I made a law because I've traveled all over the globe looking for Arabic scientific manuscripts. And then I reached the conclusion, wherever there are Muslims, there is a mosque. Wherever there is a mosque, there is a library attached to the mosque. And wherever there is a library, there is a system in the Islamic system to donate books as waqf, endowments. And those waqf books are still in plenty. If I go, for example, just to one city in India, which I have visited several times, a city by the name of Hyderabad, it is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and it has 5 major libraries. Andhra Pradesh is in the center of India. And there I found 5 major libraries. Each one of them has at least 2,000 to 3,000 Arabic books, and about 600 to 700 of them dealing with science, and nobody has actually read. Cataloging them is a serious problem. So what we know of our own intellectual history of Islamic civilization, including the Arabic civilization, because most of that history was written in Arabic, what we know is the very, very tip of the iceberg. It's even less, in my estimate, much less than 1% of what actually is still there and needs to be looked at before we claim that this was an age of decline, this was a golden age. All of those trivial questions, trivial answers, they don't rest on good foundations. So that's my quick answer. We need to bring a generation who can read, hopefully.
I'll ask one more question. Is there a particular branch of philosophy or science which Professor Saliba thinks will benefit from classical Islamic sciences?
I think that the only branch that I think is relevant is to go into the philosophy of science itself, meaning when somebody like Ghazali attacks the Islamic philosophers for not being thorough enough, he was attacking them on the basic foundation of what we now understand to be the inductive method of science. He says, if you bring a cotton next to fire, and it will catch the fire. Well, you bring it again, it catches the fire. Again, it catches the fire 3 or 4 times. Is that enough to make a general law and say fire will always burn the cotton? Or we should be able to speculate, when do we actually reach the general conclusions, and what kind of power does the inductive method of science give us to make these general laws? That, I think, is most relevant. Ibn Taymiyyah did the same thing. By the way, he wrote a book that he called Tahafut Not al-Falasifa al-Rad ala al-Mantiqiyin. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a attack on the logicians, because the logicians have already also took few cases and generalized them. We still do that, by the way, and I chastise my students severely. And this is a new tradition in Beirut. I never saw it before. But since I have come back in 2018 or 19, I find everybody telling me, "Billu kifak, mashi al-hal, billi 100%. What is this 100%? I asked them, where do you get this certainty of 100%? Aristotle never actually reached that conclusion. Where do you reach that conclusion? We accept 80%, 90%, but this 100% is a confidence statement that only comes with somebody who really has that. Where do they get it? I don't know. But I have a feeling that we over-exaggerate what we know.
Yeah.
Should be more humble.
Well, I have enjoyed this at least 90%, at least.
See, 100%, your questions were much better.
Professor, this has been a real privilege to be able to chat with you. I appreciate it so much. And I'm sure there are going to be tons of questions in the comments for once we post this video. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you.